O Lord, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom hast thou made them all. The earth is full of thy riches, so is this great and wide sea, wherein are things creeping innumerable, both small and great beasts. There go the ships. There is that leviathan, whom thou hast made to play therein. Psalm 104. On March 24, 1844, flanked by dignitaries in the chambers of the Supreme Court of the United States, Dr. Samuel F.B. Morse sent the first telegram on the newly constructed Baltimore and Washington telegraph line. Morse's telegraph was just part of a series of revolutions that were sweeping the nation in both communication and transportation. The Erie Canal, opened in 1825, connected Albany to Buffalo, and was used by a young Herman Melville, who traveled the length of the canal in a boat over the course of 3 days. The earliest section of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was opened in 1830, and it was on this line, 3 years later, that Andrew Jackson became the first president to ride the Iron Horse. This was also an age of reform and revivalism. Abolitionism, temperance, and the women's suffrage movement all coincided with the new wave of American Protestant evangelism, the Second Great Awakening. It should come as no surprise that the phrase Morse sent to Baltimore, as suggested by Miss Annie Ellsworth, was a quote from the Book of Numbers, "What hath God wrought?" The phrase was suggestive of America's emerging self-conceptualization as a new Israel, or, in the phrase of John Winthrop, a shining city upon a hill. The Puritan settlers of Massachusetts were strict Calvinists, and they held to a harsh interpretation of the Christian doctrine of predestination. According to Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, God had not merely predestined the elect for salvation, he had also reprobated the rest of humanity, withdrawing his offer of salvation and giving them over to eternal damnation. Even though, as a good Calvinist, the Puritans held to the persistence of the saints, once saved, always saved, the doctrine of predestination caused a considerable amount of anxiety, as it was never clear to each individual believer whether or not he or she might be among the elect or not. One of the signs that early American Protestants looked for as some assurance of salvation was material prosperity. As a result, New Englanders valued thrift, hard work, and deferred gratification. The Protestant work ethic is exemplified in Moby-Dick by the first mate Starbuck in his exchange with Captain Ahab. "But what's this long face about, Mr. Starbuck? Wilt thou not chase the white whale? Art not game for Moby-Dick?" "I am game for his crooked jaw, and for the jaws of death too, Captain Ahab, if it fairly comes in the way of the business we follow. But I came here to hunt whales, not my commander's vengeance. How many barrels will thy vengeance yield thee, even if thou gettest it, Captain Ahab? It will not fetch thee much in our Nantucket market." Starbuck here remembers not only the investors back home in Nantucket, but also the exhortation of St. Paul to leave vengeance to the Lord. "Vengeance on a dumb brute," cried Starbuck, "that simply smote thee from blindest instinct. Madness! To be enraged with a dumb thing, Captain Ahab, seems blasphemous." Men like Starbuck, a Quaker and a pacifist, seek signs of divine assurance in their deadly occupation of whaling. Ahab, a fighting Quaker by contrast, has been met with a permanent wounding, his leg shorn off and replaced by the bone of a lesser whale. If success is a sign of promised salvation, disaster can only come as a consequence of sin and a sign of damnation. Beginning with camp revivals, like the one held at Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801, the Second Great Awakening was soon spread eastward by circuit riders and continued well into the 1830s. The religious fervor was so strong in the western and central regions of Melville's home state of New York that it became known as the Burned Over District. In keeping with the new democratic spirit of the age, the new evangelism rejected the Calvinist doctrine of predestination as too fatalistic, and instead focused on the individual emotional experience of sinners being brought to repentance. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was less than impressed by the growing spirit of millennialism, derisively referred to the new sects as come-outers, just as he had dismissed transcendentalism as smoke, mist, moonshine, raw potatoes, and sawdust. Melville, too, seems to take aim at the radical individualism of the day with his portrayal of the monomaniacal Ahab, all the while filling his greatest novel with religious imagery. Biblical language and allusions abound in Moby-Dick, beginning on the first page. Ishmael, our narrator, is named for the first son of Abraham, ancestor of the Arabs, and described as a wild man in the book of Genesis. Cast out into the desert from the tents of his father, Ishmael and his mother Hagar are saved miraculously by an intervention from the angel of the Lord, which may prefigure the rescue of Melville's Ishmael at the novel's conclusion. When Ishmael and Queequeg leave the Pequod, after having signed with her, they are warned by the raggedy sailor Elijah that the ship is bound for destruction. Like the biblical prophet of the same name, this Elijah prophesies against another Ahab, the captain bearing the name of the king of Israel, who was so reviled that when he was slain, the dogs lapped up his blood. The biblical Ahab's reputation for wickedness was based mostly on his introduction of the Canaanite cult of Baal into Israel at the urging of his wife Jezebel. Melville's Ahab has allied himself with pagan harpooneers and the dream-reading Parsi Fedallah to assist in the hunt for Moby-Dick. The very ship he captains, the Pequod, is named after an American Indian tribe destroyed by the Puritans in the 1630s, who often compared their arrival and displacement of New World natives to the Israelite conquest of Canaan in the book of Joshua. Other whaling ships encountered by the Pequod are named for biblical figures as well, like the Jeroboam and the Rachel. The Rachel is found cruising in an attempt to locate a lost whaling boat that carried away the 12-year-old son of the ship's captain, a reference to the verse from the book of Jeremiah. Rachel, weeping for her children, refused to be comforted for her children because they were not. These Old Testament references culminate with the sermon of Father Mapple in the Whalers' Chapel of Nantucket. The sermon is on, appropriately, the book of Jonah, in which the titular prophet, in attempting to flee God's injunction to prophesy to the Ninevites, is instead thrown overboard and swallowed by a great fish. Melville's use of Jonah is not just thematically appropriate in a novel about whaling. The great fish of Jonah, far from being a dumb brute, is instead an instrument of God's justice and sovereignty in the world. And if Jonah's whale is a symbol of God's power, how much more potent a symbol of the Almighty is the white whale himself? There is a kind of divinity that hedges the white whale. Ishmael notes how more superstitious sailors claim that Moby-Dick is ubiquitous, having been spotted in different latitudes at the same time, while others claim he is immortal, or ubiquitous throughout time, and the appearance of harpoons piercing his side and twisted like corkscrews suggest his invulnerability. The most suggestive feature of Moby-Dick is his albinism, and as Ishmael contemplates the whale, he goes into great detail, describing the attributes of whiteness. But not yet have we solved the incantation of this whiteness, and learned why it appeals with such power to the soul. And more strange, and far more portentous, why, as we have seen, is it at once the most meaning symbol of spiritual things, nay, the very veil of the Christian's deity. and yet should be as it is, the intensifying agent in things the most appalling to mankind? Is it by its indefiniteness? It shadows forth the heartless voids and immensities of the universe, and thus stabs us from behind with the thought of annihilation when beholding the white depths of the Milky Way. Or is it that, as in essence, whiteness is not so much a color as the visible absence of color, and at the same time the concrete of all colors? Is it for these reasons that there is such a dumb blankness, full of meaning, in a wide landscape of snows, a colorless, all-color of atheism from which we shrink? And when we consider that other theory of the natural philosophers, that all other earthly hues, every stately or lovely emblazoning, the sweet tinges of sunset skies and woods, yea, and the gilded velvets of butterflies and the butterfly cheeks of young girls, all these are but subtle deceits, not actually inherent in substances, but only laid on from without, so that all deified nature absolutely paints like a harlot, whose allurements cover nothing but the charnel house within. And when we proceed further, and consider that the mystical cosmetic which produces every one of her hues, the great principle of light, forever remains white or colorless in itself, and if operating without medium upon matter, would touch all objects, even tulips and roses, with its own blank tinge. Pondering all this, the palsied universe lies before us a leper, and willful travelers in Lapland, who refuse to wear colored and coloring glasses upon their eyes, so the wretched infidel gazes himself blind at the monumental white shroud that wraps all prospect around him. And of all these things the albino whale was the symbol. Wonder ye then at the fiery hunt. The whiteness of the whale invokes holiness, purity, and goodness, as well as infinity, mystery, and awesomeness, the attributes of the Nantucket god. Moby-Dick's first breaching is likened to a sublime theophany. A gentle joyousness, a mighty mildness of repose and swiftness invested the gliding whale. Not the white bull Jupiter swimming away with ravished Europa clinging to his graceful horns, his lovely, leering eye sideways intent upon the maid, with smooth, bewitching fleetness, rippling straight for the nuptial bower in Crete. Not Jove, not that great majesty supreme did surpass the glorified white whale as he so divinely swam. And thus, through the serene tranquillities of the tropical sea, among waves whose hand-clappings were suspended by exceeding rapture, Moby-Dick moved on, still withholding from sight the full terrors of his submerged trunk, entirely hiding the wrenched hideousness of his jaw. But soon the forepart of him slowly rose from the water. For an instant his whole marbleized body formed a high arch, like Virginia's natural bridge, and warningly waving his bannered flukes in the air, the grand god revealed himself, sounded, and went out of sight. In 1851, the year of the novel's publication, Melville confided to Hawthorne, "I have written a wicked book, and feel spotless as a lamb." What was it about the book that Melville thought wicked? Regarding John Milton, and the depiction of Satan as an epic hero in his Paradise Lost, William Blake wrote that he was of the devil's party without knowing it. Melville, it seems, was of the devil's party as well, and Ahab's hunt for the white whale echoes the war in heaven waged by the fallen archangel Lucifer. In a black mass, Ahab, acting as anti-pope, and his pagan harpooneers swear death to Moby-Dick before drinking a measure of grog from the hollow of their harpoons in an unholy communion. Later, he will use their blood to temper the steel of a new harpoon, forged for the sole purpose of slaying the white whale. While processing slain whales, the ship, lit by the fires of the try-works, is transformed into an image of pandemonium. One sailor in particular dons the skin of a whale's member, a parody of the cassock traditionally worn by a priest. The voyage of the Pequod and its search for Moby-Dick could also be likened to the individual Protestant's struggle with God. In the Old Testament, Jacob earns the name Israel, or one who strives with God, after wrestling with the angel of the Lord near Peniel. Ahab also has a close brush with the numinous, and like Jacob, he walks with a limp for the rest of his life. Unlike the patriarch, he will not find peace from the encounter. Unlike patient Job, who repents after being shown a vision of the leviathan swimming beneath the pillars of creation, Ahab remains defiant and vows to hook his leviathan in blood and thunder. Come forth from behind your cotton bags. I have no long gun to reach ye. Come, Ahab's compliments to ye. Come and see if ye can swerve me. Swerve me. Ye cannot swerve me, else ye swerve yourselves. The path to my fixed purpose is laid with iron rails, whereon my soul is grooved to run, over unsounded gorges, through the rifled hearts of mountains, under torrents' beds, unerringly I rush. Naught's an obstacle, naught's an angle to the iron way. Like the Eastern Gnostics, who taught that the God of the Old Testament was a villain for his creation of the world, Ahab sees Moby-Dick as the incarnation of all natural evil. The white whale swam before him as the monomaniac incarnation of all those malicious agencies which some deep men feel eating in them, till they are left living on with half a heart and half a lung. That intangible malignity, which has been from the beginning, to whose dominion even the modern Christians ascribe one half of the world's, which the ancient Ophites of the East reverenced in their statue devil. Ahab did not fall down and worship it like them, but deliriously transferring its idea to the abhorred white whale, he pitted himself, all mutilated, against it. All that most maddens and torments, all that stirs up the lees of things, all truth with malice in it, all the cracks, the sinews, and cakes of the brain, all the subtle demonisms of life and thought, all evil to crazy Ahab were visibly personified and made practically assailable in Moby-Dick. He piled upon the whale's white hump the sum of all the general rage and hate felt by his whole race from Adam down, and then, as if his chest had been a mortar, he burst his hot heart shell upon it. In spite of his fierce individualism, the Calvinist doctrine of predestination still hangs over Ahab in the novel, suggesting that he is one of the reprobate, fated to damnation beyond his control. Before the final confrontation with Moby-Dick, Starbuck begs Ahab to turn around and sail home to Nantucket. Ahab responds with a contemplation of his own freedom of will. Oh, my captain, noble soul, grand old heart after all, why should anyone give chase to that hated fish? Away with me. Let us fly these deadly waters, let us home. Wife and child too are Starbuck's, wife and child of his brotherly, sisterly, playfellow youth. Even as thine, sir, are the wife and child of thy loving, longing, paternal old age. Away, let us away, this instant let me alter the course. How cheerily, how hilariously, O my captain, would we bowl on our way to see old Nantucket again. I think, sir, they have such mild blue days even as this in Nantucket. They have. I have seen them, some summer days in the morning, about this time. Yes, it is his noon nap now. The boy vivaciously wakes, sits up in bed, and his mother tells him of me, of cannibal old me, how I am abroad upon the deep, but will yet come back to dance him again. 'Tis my Mary herself. She promised that my boy every morning should be carried to the hill to catch the first glimpse of his father's sail. Yes, no more. It is done. We head for Nantucket. Come, my captain, study out the course and let us away. See, the boy's face from the window, the boy's hand on the hill. But Ahab's glance was averted. Like a blighted fruit tree he shook, and cast his last cindered apple to the soil. What is it? What nameless, inscrutable, unearthly thing is it? What cozening, hidden lord and master, and cruel, remorseless emperor commands me, that against all natural lovings and longings, I so keep pushing, and crowding, and jamming myself on all the time, recklessly making me ready to do what in my own proper, natural heart I durst not so much as dare. Is Ahab Ahab? Is it I, God, or who that lifts this arm? But if the great sun move not of himself, but is an errand boy in heaven, nor one single star can revolve, but by some invisible power, how then can this one small heart beat, this one small brain think thoughts, unless God does that beating, does that thinking, does that living, and not I. By heaven, man, we are turned around and round in this world like yonder windlass, and fate is the handspike. And all the time, lo, that smiling sky, and this unsounded sea. Look, see yon albacore. Who put it into him to chase and fang that flying fish? Where do murderers go, man? Who's to doom when the judge himself is dragged to the bar? But it is a mild, mild wind, a mild-looking sky, and the air smells now as if it blew from the faraway meadow. They have been making hay somewhere under the slopes of the Andes, Starbuck, and the mowers are sleeping among the new-mown hay. Sleeping? Aye. Toil we how we may, we all sleep at last on the field. Aye, and rust amid greenness, as last year's sighs flung down and left in the half-cut swaths. When Moby-Dick was published in 1851, it was actually met with mostly positive reviews by Anglo-American literary critics. Nathaniel Hawthorne was an admirer of the work, although some British critics were confused as to the ultimate fate of Ishmael, as the British edition omitted the book's epilogue. However, the novel was not the financial success that Melville needed it to be, and he would never again achieve the same success he had enjoyed with his early South Sea romances. Forced to seek employment as a customs agent at the port of New York, Melville followed up Moby-Dick with works like the psychological novel Pierre, or The Ambiguities, a critique of Yankee capitalism, Bartleby the Scrivener, and Benito Cereno, a condemnation of the transatlantic slave trade. Like the characters who inhabit his greatest book, Moby-Dick, Herman Melville was also a seeker of the divine. In 1856, with the financial support of his father-in-law, Melville journeyed across the Atlantic and Mediterranean to the Holy Land in hopes that it would revive his sagging spirits. His experience of Jerusalem, the city through which God had walked, was disappointing, to say the least. Upon seeing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, he wrote, "A sort of plague-stricken splendor reigns in the painted and mildewed walls. All is glitter, nothing is gold, a sickening cheat." Though it did inspire his narrative poem Clarel, a poem and pilgrimage, the trip to the Holy Land left Melville unsatisfied, and did nothing to help his faltering literary career. After the Civil War, he published a collection of poems called Battle Pieces, similar to Walt Whitman's Drum Taps in their mutual admiration of President Lincoln. Melville would die on September 28, 1891, of a heart attack, leaving behind an unfinished novella, Billy Budd, considered by some to be his unsung second masterpiece. Melville's work would remain unappreciated until the early 20th century, when modernists would rediscover his works and find that his writing techniques often anticipated their own. The centennial of his birth in 1919 would mark the beginning of the Melville Revival. Ahab and his crew, save for one, are killed in the final apocalyptic battle with Moby-Dick. In that day, the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. With Melvillian irony, the roles have been reversed. Ahab is the archfiend Satan, and Moby-Dick stands in for God, the harpooner. Even when it becomes apparent that the tide of battle has turned against him, Ahab does not relent, but instead embraces his fate. "Great God, but for one single instant show thyself," cried Starbuck. "Never, never wilt thou capture him, old man. In Jesus' name, no more of this. That's worse than devil's madness. 2 days chased, twice stove to splinters, thy very leg once more snatched from under thee, thy evil shadow gone, all good angels mobbing thee with warnings. What more wouldst thou have? Shall we keep chasing this murderous fish till he swamps the last man? Shall we be dragged by him to the bottom of the sea? shall we be towed by him to the infernal world. Oh, impiety and blasphemy to hunt him more. Starbuck, of late, I felt strangely moved to thee, ever since that hour we both saw, thou know'st what, in one another's eyes. But in this matter of the whale, be the front of thy face to me as the palm of this hand, a lipless, unfeatured blank. Ahab is forever Ahab, man. This whole act's immutably decreed. 'Twas rehearsed by thee and me 1,000,000,000 years before this ocean rolled. Fool. I'm the fate's lieutenant. I act under orders. Look thou, underling, that thou obeyest mine. Melville's description of the Pequod being stove by Moby-Dick gives it the air of inevitability. From the ship's bows, nearly all the seamen now hung inactive. Hammers, bits of plank, lances, and harpoons mechanically retained in their hands, just as they had darted from their various employments. All their enchanted eyes intent upon the whale, which from side to side, strangely vibrating his predestinating head, sent a broad band of overspreading semicircular foam before him as he rushed. Retribution, swift vengeance, eternal malice were in his whole aspect. In spite of all that mortal man could do, the solid white buttress of his forehead smote the ship's starboard bow, till men and timbers reeled. Some fell flat upon their faces, like dislodged trucks. The heads of the harpooneers aloft shook on their bull-like necks. Through the breach they heard the waters pour, as mountain torrents down a flume. Upon seeing the ship go down, Ahab delivers his final, defiant speech, before he vainly strikes Moby-Dick and is dragged down into the depths with the white whale by a fouled line. I turn my body from the sun. O ye 3 unsurrendered spires of mine, thou uncracked keel, the only God-bullied hull, thou firm deck and haughty helm and pole-pointed prow, death-glorious ship, must ye then perish, and without me? Am I cut off from the last fond pride of meanest shipwrecked captains? O lonely death on lonely life! O now I feel my topmost greatness lies in my topmost grief. From all your furthest bounds pour ye now in, ye bold billows of my whole foregone life, and top this one-piled comber of my death. Towards thee I roll, thou all-destroying but unconquering whale. To the last I grapple with thee. From hell's heart I stab at thee. For hate's sake I spit my last breath at thee. Sink all coffins and all hearses to one common pool, and since neither can be mine, let me then tow to pieces, while still chasing thee, though tied to thee, thou damned whale. Thus I give up the spear. At the end of the battle, as the ship vanishes beneath the waves, a calm spreads over the water, reminiscent of the flood of Noah. Now small fowls flew screaming over the yet yawning gulf. A sullen white surf beat against its steep sides. Then all collapsed, and the great shroud of the sea rolled on, as it rolled 5,000 years ago. Earlier in the novel, Ishmael had meditated upon the memorials placed throughout the whalers' chapel for whalemen who had been lost at sea. He thinks how easier it must be for those whose loved ones are entombed on dry land to imagine them rising from those graves on Judgment Day, whereas those who have lost sons and husbands to the sea must live with the gnawing doubts as to whether or not they will be dredged up at the trumpet's final sound. When the Pequod sinks, the whirlpool generated by it draws all the crew down with it, all except for Ishmael. Battered like Ixion on the wheel by the whirlpool, he is eventually saved by Queequeg's coffin. Symbolically resurrected, he floats on the water for a day and night, unmolested by the sharks and birds, as though their mouths were padlocked, like the lions in the den with the prophet Daniel. Finally, he is rescued by a ship. It was the devious cruising Rachel that in her retracing search after her missing children only found another orphan.